The Athletic.
The Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco.
The all-important Mercedes Imola upgrade, how F1 television tech has evolved, and getting rid of front and rear wings. Gary tackles all that and more. Welcome to another episode of the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. I'm Edd Straw, but more importantly, I'm joined by Gary Anderson, a veteran of decades in Formula One, mechanic, car designer, technical director, journalist. You've done just about everything over the years. So how's things?
Yeah, no, things are good. The sun's shining. I'm looking forward to the next few weeks. I mean, this is a triple header of European races, quite a mix between Imola, Monaco and Barcelona. So, you know, we've got a nice mix there of different tracks. And again, we keep saying it, after these three, I think we'll get a better picture of where we are because, people are bringing lots of stuff to this first round of European races. So it's quite important to get your act together and start scoring points now if you haven't been doing so from the past. For everybody, it's going to be difficult to catch Red Bull. You know, they're a team that seem to be on top of everything at the moment, from performance, from the maximising the driver talents, together basically, and ending up first and second in all the races with big points. So it's going to be difficult for any team to get in there, but hopefully somebody will. I don't want to say I want to see Red Bull losing, but I do want to see more competition because more competition is what racing should be all about.
Yeah, I must admit, I do quite like this triple header because it's got a couple of conventional circuits in it as well. And we've had quite a lot of weird tracks this year so far, or unusual ones. So it's nice to have Imola and Barcelona in particular. And of course, it's going to be quite a big weekend with upgrades, etc., weather allowing. So as usual, we'll start with the open talking point for you to choose, but I guess it's pretty obvious with Imola and so many upgrades coming up, what sort of area you'll be wanting to pay close attention to.
Yes, I mean, obviously upgrades are the thing that every team brings, but the main focus at the moment seems to be on what Mercedes are bringing. They've been talking a lot about it, and it's relatively probably as big an upgrade as any team that's going to appear in Imola. Ferrari as well are bringing along some stuff. So, upgrades are great. The days that we used to have, the driver in the loop simulation, and you could sort of optimize your upgrade before you got to the track, they are sort of a little bit long gone because of the ground effect nature of these cars. So if you're upgrading the car to change the performance of the underfloor, you really do need to go to the circuit and run and just get your head around it all. Because not very many teams are able to predict the porpoising and the bouncing that we saw with these ground effect cars to begin with. So it's still a very grey area as to are your upgrades going to bring you lap time at the track, or are they bringing you lap time theoretically in the simulation and hence better numbers in the wind tunnel? So there is no substitute now with the cars we've got to actually running on the track. And that's great to see us back there because it does equalise things a little bit. That it does help the smaller teams that don't have maybe the high-end technology simulation tools to actually do a reasonable job. So upgrades-wise, I'm sure the Mercedes will look a bit different because I think pressure will mean that they need to look a bit different. Will it look a bit like a Ferrari or will it look a bit like a Red Bull? I think it'll probably still look like a Mercedes. We'll just get a bit of a wipe over because it's what we see is not necessarily what makes the car ultimately perform. It all works together, and that's the important thing. We just need to make sure that you focus on the area that brings you lap time, if you can do that. Now the sort of side pod, the zero side pod that Mercedes have been running, you have to duct and redirect airflow across the top of the car to help the rest of the car work well. So you have a no sort of top, I suppose you might call it, on that. The undercut on the side pod means that airflow can go in a different direction to what it can on the Red Bull or the Ferrari. And I think if you don't focus it on a certain area to help scavenge the sides of the floor, then you potentially can lose a lot of airflow from a lot of downforce from underneath the car. Obviously, Mercedes let it go around the car and through between the rear wheel and the gearbox, or the side of the gearbox, through that diffuser gap as such. but to help the diffuser, but it doesn't help the front of the floor work so well. So that's an area where I think that what we see can influence what we don't see, and that's important. And obviously then we've got the thing about controlling it all. Once you get the underfloor working, you get the car to a certain ride height. The most important thing is maintaining that ride height for as big a percentage of time as possible around the lap. And, the driver normally gets his confidence when he hits the brake pedal for a corner. That's where you get your, the idea of what the stability of the car's like. Can you really sort of just tuck it into the corner and sort out the next problem? Or are you sort of on tiptoes thinking, oops, I'm not sure what's going to happen here? And that's whenever you need to control that platform and make sure it's as stable as possible. So Imola is a big race for a lot of people. And there's changes, obviously the weather down there is not as good as it is in England at the moment, which is a very strange thing to say, but that's true. There's a lot of rain about. And this new tyre allocation, cutting the tyres from 13 sets per driver to 11 per driver. Sometimes I wonder about those things because you can't run as much if you've got less tyres. So are we going to see a bit of a reduction in running and everybody focusing a little bit more just on the qualifying and the race as such, keeping tyres for that? It's the first weekend of that change. I think it's happening twice this year. But it's the first weekend of that change. And I suppose in reality for teams like Mercedes and Ferrari who are riding with lots of different bits and pieces, it's probably the wrong time for it to happen. Because I think, whenever you go to back-to-back some stuff on the car or optimize the setup a little bit, you really do want to run as much as possible. And if that means firing another set of tyres on the car, then that's what you would do, because it's more important to get the best out of the car you can than save a set of tyres. But as I say, with 11 sets opposed to 13, you might see a little bit of a reduction in running.
Yeah, the alternative tyre allocation, as it'll be referred to, or ATA, because F1 loves a little bit of jargon. It is interesting, though, the way things have changed from how they were before the ground effect era, because previously it would just be, right, do these parts work as expected? It's still a challenge now, but then it was just, right, we think it will create this downforce, it will make this improvement to the airflow regime. But with these cars, it's actually quite easy to draw a floor that will generate a lot of downforce. Hypothetically, I could probably even do that. I wouldn't have a chance in hell of making it actually work in the real world because of the need to control that ride height. So that does probably fundamentally change how you go about running things, doesn't it? Because you need to run through a range of different ride heights and that kind of thing. So I presume you're looking for slightly different things from your run plan than you might have done with a conventional top body upgrade of 2021, for example.
Yeah, you are. The big thing really, I suppose, is to say that these cars are producing a much bigger percentage of downforce from the underfloor than they were in the past. It was probably, I don't know, just rough estimates, 25% of the downforce of the car would be produced by the floor and the diffuser. And part of that would be the barge boards as well. So they were a big part of it. The barge boards themselves were probably responsible for 15% of the car's downforce. So the floor itself was a big flat area. It didn't really, you couldn't do very much with it. You could lengthen it, shorten it, change the edge of it, try and seal it better, all sorts of stuff. But they were genuinely fairly small returns. But now it's a big return. So you've got to really focus on it because, again, the underfloor now is producing well in excess of 50% of the downforce of the car. So it's a major part of it. And obviously, if you take the underfloor, the efficiency of that underfloor is probably, 10 to 1, somewhere up in that region. It's very, very efficient itself. Whereas the rear wing itself is probably 3.5 to 1. So, what you want to do is have an underfloor that's producing lots and lots of downforce, very stable centre of pressure, be able to run smaller wings on the car, or smaller rear wing in the car, which is very draggy, to get the straight line speed. And if you can do all that, then you've sort of got a Red Bull. And that's what everybody's trying to achieve because, at the end of the day, that's what they've got. They've got a car that's producing the downforce, quick around the corners, quick in the straight, even quicker in the straight with the DRS, and they can control the platform. So they've dotted the I's and crossed the T's on a big percentage of the car, a much bigger percentage of the car than other teams have done. And that's the thing. No team out there knows 100% of what really makes the car function correctly. But there's one team always pops up knowing more than the rest. And this point in time, it's Red Bull.
And one interesting thing as well is obviously this is something that you've got experience of, but most people don't. When you go to an event like this, as Mercedes, obviously this is not just a normal upgrade, it is a change of direction. It's almost the start of the recovery, and it validates all the work they've done. So there's quite a lot at stake here, isn't it? It has to work. If it doesn't work, then they'll be looking back to think, oh, right, there's something else we haven't found that we need to correct. So what's it like when you go into a weekend, when you have an upgrade that has so much at stake, and then what happens when it works and what happens when it doesn't work? Because I imagine you'll have been through both in your time.
Well, the reality is, and a lot of people have said it in the past, and I suppose, Jenson Button was one of them whenever he drove the Brawn the first time. By the time you go around 2 laps, 3 laps, if you've got a good car or if you haven't got a good car, because it just gives you the feeling in the car that it just feels all stable. So in the Mercedes garage this weekend, there's probably those first 3 laps or 5 laps that each driver goes out and does. There's going to be a fair amount of fingers crossed. And then basically if you're going to have an uphill struggle, or whether it's suddenly, oh, this is okay, let's polish it, It's never that easy, but you definitely get a direction from the car. And then after a couple of little setup changes, and if the car responds to those setup changes, because you're trying to optimize the car, after a couple of setup changes and it goes the right direction, you think, yeah, okay, this is working, this is a decent package. But if you do a couple of setup changes and the opposite happens, or nothing happens, put a little bit more front wing on because you had a little bit of understeer and suddenly you got more understeer, then there's a different reason for those sort of things happening than the logic sort of dictates. That's whenever you really sort of sign it off. But I think the initial impression over that first little bit of the first session will be important. And it's also important to make sure you don't con yourself, Don't do anything that's abnormal, Don't run it on the sniff of an oily rag for the first 10 minutes because you just want to sort of, set up a good lap time. You really have to do your job diligently and make sure that you work within the parameters of what you believe is the right way of working over a weekend to get the best out of any package. And that means doing all your homework correctly. So, initial feedback from the driver, even though the lap time might not be there, is vitally important. If suddenly the driver feels confidence in the stability of the car reacts to having a little bit of understeer, and you put more steering lock on it and it still grips and doesn't just understeer more, all that sort of stuff, all those little transient conditions, that's what the driver feels, and that's what he wants to come back and tell you. It doesn't matter if you've got 10 kilograms of fuel, 50 kilograms or 100 kilograms in it. That's what you want to sort of find out, the way the driver reacts to what the car's doing. And then you can simulate the fuel load easy. That's easy enough to sort it out. 0.3 of a second or whatever it is for 10 kilograms. That's just a number. So you don't have to go out there and show to the world that I've got a really quick car, unless it's real. And what we see with the Red Bull quite often is it's, with Verstappen, it's usually quite difficult to go slow. He goes out and drives the car to how it feels. And that's important as well, because the car will be a different beast driving it at 9 tenths to driving it at 10 tenths. So it's quite important to give the feedback based on how you're going to drive the car, knowing that there's a little bit more track I can use, knowing that I can brake a little bit later, but you do everything you can as near to the limit as possible every lap, because that feedback's really important.
Yeah, and it's going to be the big talking point of the weekend will be upgrades in general, specifically that Mercedes one. Obviously, we'll be taking a close look at that. And the real acid test for Mercedes will be when your article comes out on the race, taking a look at the car once we've got enough images as to whether you think it's in the right direction or not. But yeah, new front suspension, floor, side pods, and the engine cover I think will change a bit. They said they've had to change a bit under the bodywork in order to get the new side pod geometry fitting. So hopefully it's going to be quite interesting visually, and we'll be taking a very close look at that with Gary, as always. Our interview today is all about the technology of F1's television offering, which, like all sports broadcasting, has evolved hugely over the past few decades. And Gary, this is a topic close to your heart. You've worked for FOM in the past on the TV coverage, and obviously you're very, very big and always have been very big in how Formula One has presented itself to the fans watching and how it connects them to what's a very complicated sport. So what do you make of the current output in general and how much it's changed?
Well, it's changed a lot. I'd like to go back, first of all, to one of my first ventures with a camera on a racing car. We were doing some testing at Paul Ricard many years ago with James Hunt and McLaren. I think it was 1977. And we had this French TV company come along and they wanted to do some stuff. Again, I think it was for Monaco, that they were going to try and put a camera on the car on a rollover bar. It was a camera. You saw it was a camera. It was a big camera. And they come along, strapped it all on there all quite happily. And off went James out for a lap with this camera running to sort of see what sort of pictures it would pick up. And that time, Paul Ricard, the pit lane was split into two halves. In other words, you come out of the last corner, turned right into the pit lane. The first half of the pit lane then exited over a bridge onto the front straight. And the second half of the pit lane, cars came in under that bridge and exited at the end of the pit lane. And we were down at the end of the pit lane, as we had been for any test that we've done there. We had this garage that was all set up for us. And James did a couple of laps and then came around to come into the pits, and we all sort of went, didn't we tell him to come in the top entry and not under the bridge? Nope. And he came under the bridge and there was no camera. So it did a lot of damage, I have to say. The car was okay, but the camera was definitely second hand after that. So going from there to technology currently, I think we've got some fantastic TV shots. I mean, to a level that it gets better all the time, basically. That's all you can say. The thing that, I spent a little bit of time in 2014 with FOM, and it was when the hybrid engines were introduced and the noise was, pretty bad. The thing was that, the microphones and whatever on the barriers picking up the car sound were all still placed in the same position as they were for the high screaming engines of yesteryear. So they were at the end of the straight, basically, where the engines were always singing and dancing. But the hybrids don't do that. That's the end of the straight is where they're quietest. So a bit of skullduggery with the cameras, moving them around a bit, moving them in the car, all that sort of stuff with the microphones that fed the cameras helped the noise and sound a little bit. But all the other stuff, the graphics that we're seeing, the tyres, the type of tyre that was on the car when you did the lap time, the tyre you're using currently, all that, when it all works correctly. And I have to say there are a few occasions when it seems to trip up and not be there. Then I think it's very informative for anybody sitting outside of it. The things that you like to know is, who did what on what tyre, because there's such a big difference. Running a brand new tyre to run an old tyre, or running a medium to hard to soft, there's always, that 3-4 half a second difference. So it makes a big difference to see it on TV and actually get your head around it, knowing that, Joe Bloggs hasn't had a run on soft tyres yet. He's down in 9th place. That's going to be pretty good because take half a second away from his time, he's going to be up in 3rd or 4th. So the more information you can get if you're a viewer, and even a viewer with experience like I am, it's better. You definitely see a better show. I would like to know a little bit more about whenever we get the heavier fuel runs, sort of separate that from the fastest lap, because, we see it and we see he's 5 seconds or 6 seconds slower, but that's okay. But where's the other guys that are doing the same sort of fuel run? So there's always more to do, but as far as what we've got now, it's obviously fantastic, and they do a great job at getting the show on the road. I mean, it's a huge operation to do that, and it's not a cheap operation. So yeah, pat on the back to all involved with that, because it's getting better. It's got a lot better, and it's getting better every day.
Yeah, and certainly for those who remember watching Formula One 20, 30, 40 years ago, completely transformed in terms of what you get. So it was interesting to hear from the horse's mouth what they were doing. So our guest today is Dean Locke, F1's Director of Broadcast and Media. He's worked for F1 and has been heavily involved in the television coverage for a quarter of a century, and therefore offers a unique perspective on the evolution of the coverage and the remarkable technological effort required to bring it to our screens. So here's my interview with Dean Locke. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Dean Locke, the Director of Broadcast and Media. Thanks for joining us. Can you just give a quick outline of what your actual job is as Director of Broadcast and Media?
Hi, Ed. Yes, I can. Director of Broadcast and Media. So Broadcast and Media incorporates multiple departments, and fundamentally we look after all content and elements that you're going to see, and the viewers and the fans will watch Formula One. So across multiple platforms, we provide that, whether that's the traditional broadcast feeds, whether that's digital, social, F1 TV, all of those various elements, and the departments that incorporate broadcast and media are involved in engineering, onboard cameras, audio, live production, post-production, digital operations, digital technology. So anything really to do with media for Formula One.
Excellent. A nice broad overview, therefore, you've got of the whole operation. Perhaps we could start off by outlining the scope of the operation and the amount of just sheer technology involved in bringing a live broadcast with all of those elements you mentioned from a Grand Prix track, which is obviously a pretty large area to be covering.
Yes, of course. We have two. It's easy to describe it in two operations. So here in sunny Kent, Biggin Hill, we have our Media and Technology Centre. We have a race system side, which is more to do with the race services and timing of the event and the elements for the teams. But on the broadcast and media side, we've just finished. We started it just after Abu Dhabi and finished it for Bahrain testing our new look Media and Technology Centre, which hosts all our operation of all the media. So whether that's editing or the live production, the directors, the producers are all based here. And then at the event, we have an event technical centre, which some of you, if you've been to a track, may have seen or even seen on camera or helicopter shot. Is a silver building. And in there is acquisition for all the data and all our media points as well. So cameramen are at track, audio people and interviews and talent are at track, and the curation of all those data, video, all those signals really is all done here at the Media and Technology Centre to produce all the feeds and programming.
And of course, with that split, that's shifted a little bit in the past few years, hasn't it? I guess first through necessity because of COVID, but also because of the wider picture of sustainability and trying to reduce the amount of travel. So how much has that changed over the last 3 or so years in terms of how much you're able to do not on site?
Dramatically, really, it has changed. As you said, it was forced on us by COVID. We brought forward a 5-year plan into, I think, about 9 to 12 weeks to do a remote operation. And just what we did over this winter to make that a permanent housing and a permanent sort of structure and consideration was the next step for that. We ran with it for 2 to 3 years as it was. But it was still the containers that we used to ship around the world were just put into a hangar here at Biggin Hill. So it wasn't the best place to work. And now we've made that sort of fit for purpose. It's hard. It's very hard to compare actually to 2019 because we're doing so much more. So any new element that we do, whether that's F1 TV, F1 Live, whether that's the massive increase in digital programming, or any enhancements or technology that we brought into the world feed programming as well, is all done here at Biggin Hill. So nothing really ends up at track unless there's a very good reason for it. And therefore, it's not really comparing apples to apples to, just saying, well, we've cut this much freight, these many people, which we did dramatically. But actually, that's been an ongoing process all the way through. And I've done a few races back here last year, and I plan to do a lot more actually races back here because it's a really good environment to work in, and the producers and the directors and all the editors. We're doing commentary from back here, multiple races as well. We have a new bespoke studio to do here. There's still elements you need to do at track, and whether that's technology-wise, because which don't have the connectivity potentially to do everything, back here, or it's just to bring to the fans exactly what's going on the track. We don't have robot cameramen, so all the cameramen and audio people are all there as well.
Well, you mentioned connectivity there. That's obviously one of the big challenges because you need to be able to do everything in real time from Biggin Hill, and you're dealing with all sorts of different geographical locations. So how do you ensure that you've got that necessary speed of data throughput to actually make that work? Because I guess if you have too much of a lag, it just becomes unworkable.
Yes, you're quite right. And we've just done the race in Australia, which is probably one of our biggest challenges on many levels. People working in England through the night is a challenge, but also, as you said, it's our furthest race really. It's good. We have a great partner in providing us with that connectivity. The delays were talked about when we were discussing remote operations. There was a lot of talk about latency and delay, and actually we overcame that very, very quickly. To give you some sort of figures, data from cars and teams really, and from timing beacons around the track is, to our event technical center is probably 10 milliseconds. It's pretty small. I think what we were working on for that latency in Australia, which is our worst one, is about 250 milliseconds. And, when we go to a place like Austria, you'll get that down to, 150, potentially even less. There is a little element about the way that the crews work. If the main director asks the track director to hold a shot, sometimes he's actually already taken the next shot, which is incredibly frustrating because he can't turn back time. But they got to grips with that very, very quickly. We use those delays in some elements, but it's the technology there. It's also about redundancy. So what if we have a problem with our connectivity? So we have a full redundancy system that we can switch to a satellite broadcast and satellite uplinks from the track as well. We've sort of tweaked and created a very clever system.
And looking at the challenge of actually bringing the sound and the visuals from the track, for an average circuit, how many kind of cameras and microphone positions are you needing just to do the trackside action?
Well, as some tracks are very different. So something from Austria, compared to a really camera hungry like Saudi Arabia or somewhere like that. But on average, there's about 50 cameras, about 30 around the track. Then we have 5 to 7 roaming cameras in the pit lane. We have cable cameras, helicopters, fixed pit wall cameras, studio cameras for press conferences. And then on the cars, we roughly have about 80 to 90 onboard cameras across the 20 cars, actually also including the safety car. So there's a lot of inputs. Microphones, approximately, we do 5.1 surround sound, so we have about 150 microphones around the track as well. Some tracks easier than others, really close to the action where we're going next. Somewhere like Baku, a little bit easier than big runoff areas like somewhere like Bahrain. Really.
Obviously, the sound is something that's been a big talking point probably for about 10 years now, ever since we had the engine formula change. But how much work has been done in terms of improving the capture of that audio? Because thinking back to 2014, one of the things I found quite striking was that the engine sounded much better when you're actually standing there trackside compared to how they came over on the television. And that has improved over time, and I guess is an ongoing thing. So there must be quite an art to that sort of positioning and trying to actually get that sound quality and that impact that is actually there, even if it's a little more subtle than maybe it was with the old school engines.
I think you're right. I think audio sometimes is a sort of forgotten medium of our sport, isn't it, really? And how important it is. Yes, it's continual. It's still going on now. I had our head of onboard cameras in my office yesterday talking about a new microphone placement and a new microphone. So we're continually doing it. Our audio department around the track really work hard. They also want to reflect the event. So we want to hear the cars, but there's some of these tracks like Montreal and Melbourne, there's some fantastic crowd noise as well. And that is we want to try and bring that to the viewers, to the fans of, what it's like also actually being trackside, being the event. So you do hear the cars, but, hearing that the fans react quicker than our cameras sometimes at turn 2 in Montreal is also really impactful. So lots of different microphones, as I said, 150 microphones. We're looking at even some developments in audio at the moment as part of the 23-24 upgrade of, how can we make that more surround sound as well and really encompassing it. Formula One, the pictures you see is normally cars coming towards you. a long way away, sometimes on some big lenses, and a lot of the audio is coming out the back of the car. So a lot of sort of, a strategic approach about how we fill that in, but it's just a continual operation. We review post-race the audio mix of the world feed after every single race.
And talking about the actual visuals, again, it's another interesting thing. I regularly have the chance to watch the car's trackside, and you do see, if you're standing there, a slightly different, you see almost sort of more detail. So that there'll also be a great art in terms of improving the cameras and the positioning to get the best effect for the viewers. So how much work has gone into that, and how much progress has there been into trying to do the cars justice, if you like, because they can look like they're on rails and they're not, but because everything's quite subtle, that's a difficult thing to communicate visually on a television.
I agree. I feel like I've spent the majority of my career trying not to slow fast cars down and really show the cars in the best way they can. As you said, they're quite incredible when you see them at the track. It's not just about acceleration; it's also braking. It's immense, and less so myself, but certainly the track direction team and the track cut team they're all full time. They review all their camera positions after every single race, whether that's a camera they didn't use or whether it didn't tell the story in the right way. And that's why, we moved to a full-time team for our producers and directors, really. So they didn't rush off to another sport like they choose they do football or tennis. They're here reviewing, post every race and scrutinizing every single camera that's doing the right job. It's a very subjective view sometimes. We get, you talk to ex-drivers and they want to see an angle of an overtake, which is very different, to potentially a viewer wants to see, whether that's a high and wide view of an overtake of exactly what lines they took. We had some brilliant overtakes, didn't we, with Fernando Alonso in Bahrain? Quite incredible ones. And we tried to shoot them in different ways, and then way that you want to see the highlights. Do you want to, we talk to replay people a lot. It's not just about the event, it's the build up to the event, whether that's an off or whether that's an overtake as well. And because we're covering 20 multiple stories all simultaneously, sometimes we're not always live. So there's a lot of craft in what replays are shown, how we do those replays as well. And we're always looking at new technology and how to cover that. Whether that's high motion, slow motion, helicopter angles, onboard angles, to try and portray them.
In terms of that spotting things, obviously you've got so many visual inputs, so many camera feeds. Is there any kind of automation, any use of AI to recognise anything out of the ordinary, shall we say, that can help automate that process? Or is it purely manual? You've got to have eyeballs on screens and say, right, this has happened. Or is there some early warning system you can use or are working on to try and help that sharpness of reaction?
We're moving into that machine learning area a little bit in various areas, not so much spotting of incidents or activities. Although saying that, we have played around with some machine learning and actually working on the back end of some of our AWS work and our AWS graphics work in telling stories before they happen. So actually, doing the job of an incredibly good producer of spotting stories before they happen, using all the data, using all the timing data and everything we have. We have that, it's a really good graphic, actually, Battle Forecast. It's a massive extension of that, of being able to predict stories before they come. How's it going to catch? What's the pit stop window? Has the pit stop window changed? Because we've had 4 laps under safety car. So we are working on a concept around that. We also break the broadcast down into parts. Years ago, if you go to a traditional outside broadcast truck, the director at the front, a vision mixer at the front, and then a director and a line of producers and an executive producer. We have very much sub-mixes, so a track sub-mix, lesser to an extent, pit sub-mix and onboard camera sub-mix. And the workflow to bring that together for the main director, to bring all those feeds together, is very well orchestrated. It's very well rehearsed as well, and we get good practice. We do it a lot. And of course, we're not just doing the race on Sunday. We're doing all the support series races as well. So there's a lot of rehearsal going on. That's what really helps us try to spot these stories. Of course, you can't spot someone making a mistake and slipping off always, but we also have every single camera monitored, as I said, and our replay channels as well, and our replay operators. And also, I think it's the experience and the skill of the crew that we have. We have crew here that we've handpicked from other sports. And we've also got crew here that have been here 25 years and onwards and looking at those races. And if we go all the way back to why F1 now does all the host feeds, that was part of that, because, the local countries that were doing the host feeds were picking the best director there, but they were potentially doing one, maybe two races a year at times. And whereas, a lot of the crew are doing 20 plus races.
You're listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Aramco continuously push the limits of engineering excellence. As the global energy partner of F1, they drive a shared vision to real-world innovation that aims to lower emissions, enhance performance, and accelerate human potential. Aramco, powered by HAL.
And you mentioned the graphics there that are integrated into it. Obviously, there's a huge amount of data being piped through. I think people will be amazed by the data that you've got access to. Probably stuff teams aren't very keen on having out there. But how do you go about actually working out the best way to scavenge that data to enhance the show? Because there'd be this temptation to do too much, and then almost the whole broadcast becomes a sort of data analysis, which is going too far. And how do you actually achieve that analysis in effectively real time if you're trying to hit pit stop window? I guess pit stop jumping is a relatively simple one among those, but there's a lot of complicated stuff going on there, drawing on a lot of live data.
Yeah, I could probably talk to you about days about how graphics are very complicated on Formula One and where you draw that line. And as you said, there's each car has something like 300 sensors. We're picking up 40-odd thousand data points every second around the track, whether that's timing or car data, positioning data. There is a lot of data coming in. We also have this real range of audience, in the last few years as well. We picked up a younger audience, a lot of female fans as well, really getting into the sport, which is fabulous. It's what every sport, really dreams of at the moment. But then we have some fans that are really entrenched viewers. They enjoy Formula One because of the strategy, because of the complexity. As you know, very much, it's a really complicated sport and a lot of things happening simultaneously all at the same time. It's not a stadium sport where it's happening, in front of your eyes. Graphics, we spend an awful lot of time. I remember when Ross Brawn came to Formula One, and he immediately sort of marched over and said there wasn't enough data, wasn't enough information on the screen. And I said, look, Ross, politely, not many of our fans do have their name on the World Championship trophy. So that sort of varied audience, what we're trying to please. And I think we find a balance. We go through a lot of process to look at a graphic. Is it too technical? Does it make sense? Is it worth the real estate on the screen? We have a lot of graphics on screen. If you look at pictures from 20 years ago to what we have now, there's a lot more graphics on the screen. And, the sort of premise is they've all got to earn their space. And, whether that's research we do with younger generations or entrenched fans, there is a lot of research going on that we never used to do, actually, internally and externally as well. And just checking that I watch a lot of other sports, and actually sometimes this graphic, I know a bit about sports broadcasting, and sometimes this graphics, I'm not sure what they're trying to tell me. And that is a real premise. There's a graphic, okay, some of them are more, 4-hour entrenched fans, but they've still got to make sense, and they've got to be, easily to read and understand. Not always for every single fan because of the varied fans, and also the session's different. What we might show on a practice session to that viewer could be very different to what we show in a race where we have, a lot more viewers and a lot more varied viewers, as I've said. And I think it's, as you quite rightly said, it could just be numbers, couldn't it? And those numbers have really got to tell a story. So something, we've worked, a lot over the last few years is telling the story around strategy, Formula One strategy. Yeah? A Formula One strategist, I guess, wants to do exactly the opposite of what we want to do. They want to completely be able to dictate what their car will do from lap 1 all the way to the finish. And they want to know all the paths that car will take and plan ahead and have that. We want unpredictability in Formula One. And we want to keep the fan engaged. So we've got to be able to tell that story, but actually with that, sort of element of surprise. But then we also want to unpack what fantastic athletes these drivers are doing and all the elements they're doing on the car, one-handed, and being talked to by their engineer and changing settings and try and sort of demystify some of those settings. And working with our own internal, sport team as well. Pat Simmons, quite often I'll sit with Pat at lunch and again to explain a couple of things to us. So we were able to tell that story in a tangible way. But very difficult. Don't get a job in Formula One graphics if you like weekends, nights and holidays, because they work incredibly hard.
Yeah, well, there's just so much to be done there, and I guess you can never do enough in terms of what the potential is. But another topic is the technology. As I understand it, you've got some pretty cool AI technology being used for some of the replays. I'm not right in saying you can use that to enhance the replay qualities for kind of super slow-mo type visuals of incidents?
You're right. We did a trial in Austin. And a smaller trial in Mexico as well with a system. I don't know if you remember, Alonso actually grabbed some air on the back straight in Austin. So that replay was a AI slow-mo, actually, that we managed to do. So it seems weird, slowing down a really fast sport. But sometimes you've got to slow down a really fast sport to explain it, understand it. Really cool imagery as well sometimes, isn't it? And a slow-mo, you have so many frames that you can slow down a camera shot before it becomes jittery and jumpy. Over the past we've had slow motions, super slow motions, and high motions. I think I've seen them all really as they come through. And actually what we're working with now is we only have a certain amount of high motions. They're data hungry, they're quite difficult to manage. They take in a lot of light as well. So at some tracks they can be quite tricky, like Singapore. But actually, how can we make what we trialed is how can we make all our cameras high motion? So that failed pit stop or that incredible pit stop as well. How can we do that on a normal pit stop camera or a handheld camera in the pit lane? How can we create that to make that what actually happened on that car? It was slowing a pit stop from 2.5 seconds. Great stories out 2.5 second pit stops can be quite hard. So how can we pick that stuff out? And that's exactly what we did. I won't get too technical with you, but it basically makes up frames. So yeah, they have the physical frames they have, and then it interpolates frames in the middle, which as a broadcast student in my early life would have blown my head off, I think. With that technology, but it actually makes up the frames and creates that. And that's what we did with the Alonso catching the air on the back straight. We managed to slow that really down to, it's probably getting on for 500-600 frames a second, something like that. We're also 4K broadcaster. So we're talking, 4K in high motion, incredibly data hungry. And that's exciting, whether that's helicopter, our cable camera in the pit lane, or as we said, handheld RSF. So we'll be able to improve the quality and make up frames. And that's really exciting. We should be doing some more trials with that throughout this year.
One of the visuals that I personally always remember that didn't seem to last that long, so I'll take this opportunity to ask about it. I think about 2009, way back then, there was some experiments with kind of ghost cars by sort of overlaying cars over each other. I always remember there was a great shot from Valencia when Ferrari had Badoa and Raikkonen, and you could see Badoa braking later, but then losing all the time. And
yep.
I remember at the time being said that was a very labour-intensive thing to do, so it wasn't necessarily rewarding, but I thought it was one of the best visualisations of how a car produces its speed. Is there any possibility of seeing something like that again? Yes. Purely a personal thing, because I just thought it was really good.
Yes, definitely. I'm happy to say yes to that. To the question, will you see any more of that? That in 2009, that it was actually, I think it was a golf swing simulation tool we actually used for that, where you overlay golf swings. The problem we had, and we used it a lot in practice session, was what were the two cars doing? Were they at the same fuel load? Were they on the same setup and things like that? So there's an element of distrust about the shots. So actually what we really need to do is do it in race mode, do it in qualifying mode when we know the cars, are set up to give a like for like comparison. But doing it live is the real target. We're not in a stadium, so we have cameras all around the track. We're not permanent structures, going in and out of Melbourne. Even the fences aren't there. So, a lot of some of this stuff you see in the stadium sport is permanent rigs and permanent structures. So how do we do that? But we are looking at, again, we did a small trial last year, I believe, which was relatively successful. It's the turnaround of the clips as well, how quickly. But there are some good stories, whether that is just racing lines, hitting apexes, or it's the distance between two cars in qualifying has always been, like the rowing, isn't it? Looking at the World Championship line, chasing a line which is a really P1 line. But those comparisons you should see. We're looking at some technology at the moment, maybe even doing it on the helicopter, which is the best view of some of these angles as well. Makes it even harder because there isn't a cable to a helicopter, so that's done over radio frequency. So. But yeah, we are looking at some stuff. There's some other sports that are doing really well. Whether that's sort of America's Cup and some of the technology around there and sailing, how they do that. So yes, we are looking at racing lines. We are looking at that sort of what you've seen some elements actually already that we do on the onboard cameras, the tagging of the car in front. And there's a strip between the two cars showing the time and the distance. It's actually furthering some of that technology to be able to overlay cars visually.
Excellent. Well, I'll certainly look forward to some of that appearing because I always find that fantastic. Another bit of technology that we have started to see in recent years has been the use of drones and that kind of thing. Obviously, there's a lot of aerial shots from the helicopter because obviously there's some practicality problems, I guess, to having drones patrolling all the time. But how have you gone about integrating drones into the F1 coverage? And is that an area where there's quite a lot of potential, do you think?
I think there is potential for drones in Formula One, but I think we're chasing the technology a little bit. So, if you look at something like downhill skiing, there's some really incredible shots I've seen, just this winter gone. But there is one skier, so the drone can stay behind the skier. If we stay behind a car, there's normally another car, So working really closely with the FIA to make sure the safety procedures are in line. We have sold out events everywhere these days. So, going to a track where there aren't many fans is also, very, very long gone. So we have to be incredibly careful and safe to the fans of the track. So, there's a lot of rules around, 1,000 people per square kilometre and things like that. So there are tracks where the infield in Austin, you probably, have seen some activity where it's a little empty. We can brief the marshals that there is a drone flying, so we can do there. We've done some elements around Austria and Barcelona where there's some areas that we can use it. Formula One is still incredibly quick. And drones are quick, but they're not as quick as Formula One cars. And our twin engine helicopters have trouble keeping up Formula One cars. And so we're looking at the technology as it comes out. Is that a racing drone? But then your flying time, because batteries are a little bit less powerful. Also, we've got to get the signal off the camera live. You see these incredible drone shots from non-live sports as well now, some highlights. And it really increases the production value. But most of our outputs are live, or most of our content capture is live. So then we've got to beam that signal. We're also a 4K broadcaster, so we can't have it looking a little bit cloudy, a little bit shaky as well. So I think as that drone technology increases, you will see it. And I think we're always in communication with, those sort of partners really of what they can do and how they can help us out. But it still goes to a lot of rulings, over cities, we have to have twin engine helicopters. I don't think we're necessarily replacing a helicopter because I think there's a certain viewpoint for a helicopter. I think if if we get over that hurdle of, drones being quick enough and being efficient to use in Formula One, it'll actually be a new shot. It'll actually be a new angle that we see, like a massive rail camera, or, similar to, we have a brilliant cable camera at Silverstone, which I always think does a really great shot. It's sort of mimicking shots like that and doing things that we can't currently do, actually. So I think we will be there, but I'm not 100% sure it will be this year.
Do you have a personal favourite bit of TV technology that's used in F1? Perhaps one we haven't talked about. I don't know whether you'd have favourite ones, but ones that have made an impact, maybe something that people hadn't really clocked because it's not obvious, but really does enhance the experience.
Hey, that's a really good question. Almost not planned for it, but I think I just mentioned the cable camera in Silverstone. I think that is an incredible part of the track, an incredibly unique angle. It's really difficult to rig that camera, normally on a back-to-back race as well. But I always feel that it is worth it. I think I like the tracks like Montreal, and going to Baku soon, where we're really close to the wall, and being able to embed, cameras into the walls to really get, to see how. And actually, we're working on actually a new graphic to come up this year as well. How every single lap these drivers are just, centimeters, away from the apex or centimeters away from the wall. Incredibly accurate. How we tell that story is really good. I really like the introduction of the helmet camera. I think that really blew people away of the viewpoint for the driver. From the car and what they're doing in the car, as I mentioned before, settings on the steering wheel. I thought that was I was really pleased with the introduction of the helmet camera and how that's, brought a new sort of dimension to the coverage as well. And from a technology standpoint, we already mentioned those AI slow-mos absolutely blow my head off from a technical point, I think. But yeah, really interesting.
And just as a final question, what's the future of the F1 OTT platform? Obviously, F1 TV, people have become very familiar with, those who've got access to it, and that's really enhanced the experience. So what's the future for that in terms of its spread and its enhancement?
I think F1 TV is a great addition. So, to work alongside our broadcast partners as well. I think that the incredible archive and library you can do now, and the video on demand and the programming on it is, watch it anytime you want, is really important. I think how we deliver it, is probably, one of the sort of best in class. It really offers the viewing experience for our fans. And we're always looking at ways of getting even more content to the fans, and on different devices as well, and using, really reliable platforms like AWS platforms to deliver that. I think it's all about tailoring your experience, isn't it? So firstly, watching it when you want to watch it and how you want to watch it, and on what system. And of course, some of our broadcast partners do this as well. But also, being able to choose your onboard cameras, being able to choose the way you digest team radio. Potentially, in the future, how you digest the graphics. We brought in some, some very F1 live programming as well, which works across all the regions. There's a huge number of regions that F1 TV covers, and and even the commentary working across all those regions as well, whether it's their third language as well. But yeah, always looking at that, sort of tailoring the experience for the fan, so the fan can sort of choose the way they watch it and digest the sport as well. But it's got to be the right technology that sort of delivers the greatest value.
Excellent. Well, I think I've taken up enough of your time. Thanks very much for the insight into the F1 TV output, and thanks for bringing so much enhancement to the enjoyment of Formula One fans around the world.
Thank you, Ed. Always a pleasure.
Well, if you're listening to this podcast, you must recognise the value of asking questions. At Aramco, answering questions helps them engineer a better future. So if you'd like to know how something works in F1, we'd love for you to send us a question, and if you're lucky, we might just answer it on a future episode. You can either write us a question and email it to podcasts@therace.com, or record a voice note and remember to include your name that we can play on the show. We've got 2 questions today, and the first question comes from Trevor Lynn, who says, "I'm encouraged by Edd Straw's comment that there are no such things as stupid stupid questions. And I will say, yeah, that definitely applies. Sometimes you might get stupid answers from me, but no stupid questions, definitely. So I'd encourage anyone to write in. And Trevor continues, hopefully this one won't change his mind. Several of the ground effect cars of the 1980s dispensed altogether with front wings and only had vestigial rear wings, presumably because they generated so much downforce from the Venturi tunnels under the car. With the reintroduction of ground effect and the desire for closer racing, would it be feasible for modern F1 to ban the front and or rear wings and rely on ground effect for grip? And would this lead to closer racing and remove the need for DRS? Keep up the good work.
Well, Trevor, yeah, I will sort of back up Ed's comment about never a stupid question. And the thing is, with answers, they're an opinion as well. We do our best to bring you the correct opinion on most stuff, but obviously, there's teams of engineers out there, huge amounts of engineers, all trying to force their way through and find solutions to problems. So we're only bringing an opinion from an individual, and not always right, but we try our hardest to be as near right as possible, or to give you at least a guidance. So on your thing about the ground effect cars of the late 70s, really early 80s, yes, they were producing, and at that point in time, they were producing massive amounts of downforce compared to what they were before ground effects was introduced. And as everybody found that they were producing massive amounts of downforce, then people wanted to produce more downforce with it because it was such a big step. So the underfloor tunnel design got changed dramatically in the direction of more downforce. In other words, the throat of the tunnel, if you imagine a ground effect car of that era, it was like a wing upside down. So basically it had a throat area, the lowest point of that wing, and then the rest of it, the trailing edge of the wing as such, was a bit like a diffuser. And you were expanding the flow, and then you had sliding skirts to seal it. So underneath the car was a massive low pressure area. The peak of the low pressure would be in the throat area, just behind the throat area where the air was accelerated at the maximum. So the further forward you got that throat area and the lower to the ground you got that throat area, the more downforce you could produce. But then along came massive porpoising. And I do remember Ligier at Monza going past the pits, and Coney was a damper specialist at that time, and Coney had brought out some very high rebound dampers to try and control the ride height. So, as I say, looking then, which is what, 80s, that's 43 years ago, nothing much has changed. It was all about controlling that height, making it as consistent as possible. And I remember the Ligier going past the pits at Monza, and the front wheels were coming off the ground with porpoising. The dampers were so stiff and rebound that the peak downforce from the car got near the ground and then released because of its stalling, was lifting the front wheels off the ground. It was quite scary at that point in time, to be honest, and that's when things started changing. So people realised that actually a lot of downforce was very good, but double it and it wasn't much better. Actually, it brought so many other problems with it. So even teams that at that point in time had like holes in the front of the skirts that they could open up or close up depending upon how the porpoising was or the centre of pressure, just to make it a little bit less efficient. The last thing you wanted was a skirt that would stick up, because that was a sort of surprise to the driver. He still needed consistency, as anything did. But as you say, with the downforce producing so big in numbers from the underfloor, then teams and that tunnel effect, that throat effect going further and further forward, then front wings were sort of redundant. They either had just a very small single element trim tab type thing on the front of the car, which you could just change that little bit just to get the balance. The rear wing, I wouldn't quite agree with you that they become very small. They probably were smaller, but just the rear wing was still a bigger component really relative to the front, because you didn't produce the rear downforce with it. As you moved that throat of the tunnel forward, it produced more front downforce, but it didn't really produce more rear downforce. So the underfloor centre of pressure was moving forward all the time. And then some teams started, including ourselves, McLaren started to look at actually raising the throat of the tunnel a bit, keeping it forward but raising it so it wasn't as critical to the ground. And there was progress made to sort of, make the car a better car to drive, because it's one of those sort of things where they were so planted at that point in time. There was so much grip besides a car that had just a front and rear wing on it. It was 3-4 times the amount of downforce. So you're talking huge numbers. So yes, the front wing became more or less redundant in a lot of cars. Would it make a difference right now? Yes, it would. If the front wing wasn't there, the car would be more consistent for sure in traffic. But you would need the underfloor design to suit that. The center of pressure of the car is the important thing. It needs to be in the right position. It needs to stay as stable as possible, or it needs to do what you want with it. The normal thing you'd want to do was to move the center of pressure forward a little bit with lower speed, and move it rearwards with higher speed. So you get more confidence in the rear of the car in the fast corners, a bit less understeer in the slower corners. So it's not just take the front and rear wings off the cars. It's a matter of making sure you do the whole aerodynamic regulations to suit that. And I think you could end up with a better car in traffic, a more consistent car in traffic, but the whole regulation package would need to be done to optimize that effect. It could be done. Would it be better? You'd lose grip out of it because, again, as I say, the underfloor produces 50+% of the downforce. So that means the front and rear wing are producing 40+% of the downforce. So if you take away 40% of the downforce and a car that's not in traffic, then you'll have a slower racing car. So everything's got to compromise, and might not be the right time just to get as excited as that. One thing I would suggest is maybe going from a 4-element front wing to a 3-element front wing, which would reduce cost, complexity, reducing the amount of wings you could build per season. So you had to put a wing on the car, and the first time it left the pit lane, it had to stay on for 4 or 5 races, let's say. So you'd end up with a compromise between these next 3 races are interesting: Imola to Monaco to Barcelona. You could see 2 different wings at least on the teams for those 3 races, maybe even 3. With my way of looking at it, you'd end up with one wing would have to do all. So a bit less grip for Monaco, a bit less speed and straight for Barcelona. So, it'd be the compromise. The compromise would be bigger on the wing design, but it would reduce the amount of wings that any team had, and it would reduce the amount of changes you would do from race to race. So there is things I think could be done to A, help cost, and B, make the decisions harder for the teams to take. But they're not going to happen overnight.
And of course, the 2026 cars are in the planning stage at the moment. There's talk about movable aero and various other tricks being introduced then. So interesting to see how that direction plays out. Our second question is simply from Robert, who says, I noticed that during the Miami Grand Prix, watching on board with Max Verstappen, that nearly every other lap Max was getting radio messages from his engineer about corners he could improve on. The messages could be something like, use this brake bias for this corner, or these 2 corners are where you're losing to Checo, and a lot of display 8, position 6, etc. At one particular point, Max's engineer said something like, we have made a brake bias set up for turn 6 and 7. If you want to use it, press the red button. I took this to mean that the team were literally analysing data mid-race of the car's brake and balance performance in specific corners, perhaps relative to Checo, and then configuring a software package and remotely binding it to Max's steering wheel, so he only has to press a button and not individually configure any brake bias change himself, or even correctly identifying which brake bias is best. Thus, Max was improving lap performance, tyre management mid-race with his team's help. Is this something new? Not brake bias changes in general, which I know happen, but the team mid-race developing corner-specific programs enabled by Max pressing a button. I tried to research it, but there's very little on mid-race brake bias changes and whether it is the driver or team doing them. Is this something unique to Red Bull, to Max? I've gone on board with other teams and I could not identify other teams doing something similar. If this is slightly unique, then Red Bull are once again doing a great job.
Well, it's actually against the regulations to send anything to the car other than radio messages. You're not allowed to do that on the warm-up lap to the grid. Other than that, you're allowed to have radio contact with the driver and tell them about setup changes, tell them about tyre temperatures, tyre pressures, all that stuff that the team are analysing. And it's a big team of people that are analysing it. Most teams will have a structure of maybe 20 people back at the factory sitting there, and their job will be to look at data and see where things are going out of the working window, I suppose you might call it. And they'll also be checking one driver against the other, in this case Max against Checo. So the team could advise them on a brake balance setup for a certain corner, but they couldn't change the mapping, I suppose you might call it, via telemetry. They would have to tell them on to go to level 6 for slow speed corners and level 8 for high speed corners, or vice versa, differential settings. They can advise on all of that. and they can advise on the brake balance because of the tire temperatures. So there's lots of advice the driver can receive from the team, but the team can't change anything remotely. I suppose that's the best way of putting it. It has to be done by the driver. So I look through the regulations as well, and again they're quite hard to read unless you sit down and read them day in, day out. To pick them up and read them and take something from it is not an easy task. And they've got more and more difficult over the duration of the seasons that I've been involved with it. But any team will be advising their drivers to a certain extent. Some drivers like to chat with the engineer, get the information required all the time. Some drivers don't. They let you just get on with the job. Kimi Räikkönen was a typical example. Leave me alone. I know what I'm doing. Radio comments, which he said many, many times. Other drivers, rely on their engineer to be that third party that gives them a hand to do the job that they're not doing. Sometimes you need to just drive the car and be informed of other things. One thing you need to recognise is where the driver is happy to hear messages from. You don't want to tell them in the middle of El Rouge, for example, to use brake level 6 at corner 9. Wait till you're at a point where the driver's not focusing on his job, give him some information and then let him pick it up as necessary. So every team does the same thing. I didn't hear the actual instance that you've said you've heard on the radio or on the TV coverage. So it'd be interesting to see if we hear something, at some point in time. We'll bring it back up again. It's one of those things that shouldn't be allowed to send anything by telemetry, as far as I know. It should all be radio communication, but not on the first lap to the grid.
Yeah, and it's also one of those interesting things that when you're talking about the brake-by-wires, it's a much more complicated thing than it used to be because of the brake-by-wire technology. So that means there's a lot more going on there that the driver can't physically control all of that. There's a lot of it automated. Obviously, we know on brake-bias you can't have presets in terms of things that adjust based on where you are on the track. Because if you remember, Renault got done for that, I think, in 2019, with a system actually they've been using for quite a long time, but it was detected that this wasn't actually legal. So you're not allowed to do that. But there's probably, there are a lot of things preloaded into the car, etc., that can be manipulated. But it's the one area where it gets particularly complicated because it's not just a linear thing as it perhaps was in the days before we had the brake-by-wire.
Yeah, I mean, the brake-by-wire has changed the braking characteristics quite a lot because most teams use, very small hydraulic brakes on the rear of the car and rely on the energy recovery system to do the braking. And that works the car differently. And Red Bull, it would be quite an important thing because when you put the brakes on, basically it puts, put front brakes, for example, which are just hydraulic brakes, it puts a torque into the suspension system. So your anti-dive system works because you're putting the load through the wishbones, you're putting a torque into the wishbones into the chassis. On the rear of the car, the anti-lift system that they have on their car, which is fairly critical to its performance, again, when you put your foot on the brake pedal, the hydraulic part of that puts a torque into the rear wishbones and how that affects the car and holds the rear of the car down. But the electronic recovery system part of it goes through the driveline. So it's a bit like the engine running, but the opposite direction. Basically, when the engine's running, it's putting the load into the upright through the wheel bearings. It's pushing the suspension forward, but it's not putting a torque into the suspension system. So it doesn't really activate anything different. If you wanted to have lots of anti-squat in the car, you'd have the wishbone angles the opposite way to Red Bull. The front leg would be much higher than the back leg to sort of push the car up in the air as such, to stop it sitting down when you're leaving the corner. And when you put the energy recovery system on, it does the same. It puts the load the other direction into the upright assembly through the wheel bearing. So it's sort of pulling the car down. So the anti-lift on the back of the Red Bull, because of the energy recovery system, pulls the car down. The torque and the wishbones from the hydraulic part of that braking pulls the car down. So it's quite a different beast to past sort of common sense where the torque and the brake system was everything that was making the car attitude change. So it's a very complicated thing. And the more errs you have and the more hydraulic braking you have at the rear of the car, that's a balance between those two. So you definitely have lots of maps in the car that you could change and optimize. And to be honest, the driver, it's way above the driver probably to think about that at the time. And that's why the team are so important in the background to give them some information. And that's why maybe there's some sensors that the team shouldn't be seeing. Maybe they should just reduce the sensors that you're allowed, or the data that you're allowed to receive, change that a little bit to help make the driver more important in the equation than he is now. Obviously, the driver's still very important, driving the car, but he gets so much help from the team as to get the best out of the car. Maybe there's a change there that you could do that would change the running order a little bit.
Yeah, and it's certainly an area that Red Bull and Verstappen are very good at working on. In that race at Miami, it wasn't really till towards the end of the race that he was really happy with everything as it was and was maximising the pace, but they were going through quite an extreme process of tweaking and evolving as it went on, which made it quite an interesting one. So thanks to Trevor and Robert for those questions. And remember, if you have a question for us, send it through to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. Thanks as always to Gary for your insight. And of course, there'll be plenty more of that on therace.com during the Imola weekend, where there'll be lots of upgrades to look at and understand. And of course, we'll be back after the Monaco Grand Prix. So join us then for more from Gary. You've been listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Be sure to like, follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode.
The Athletic.